Welcome to another episode of The Dissection. Sunday Times reported that the African National Congress has threatened the Democratic Alliance, its GNU partner, that it would go to the EFF or go into the EFF if the DA refuses to accept a reduced VAT increase of between 0.75% and 1%. According to the reporting, there have been a series of meetings between the African National Congress and the Democratic Alliance since the budget speech was delayed. And in all of those meetings, the Democratic Alliance has restated its opposition to the 2 percentage point value-added tax increase, which was sought by the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana. According to Sunday Times last week, Monday, there was a special cabinet meeting where President Ramaphosa backed proposals for a middle ground approach to the increase of VAT for an increase between 0.5% and a full percentage point increase. But remember, that's not necessarily going to be a 1 point or 1% increase. The increase from 15 to 16 is a significant increase, right? It's not a 1% increase. So always remember that. But there's something that I wanted to say about the reporting as we've seen it thus far. When this story first came out, I said that there's no way that the finance minister would make a proposal for 2% without the president's buy-in or support. There's no way. And it's clear now that the president does favor a VAT increase. It's clear now because he's the one saying, okay, let's do a middle ground. Middle ground of between 0.5% to 1%. There are people who are skeptical about all of these things from the beginning. And the reason for their skepticism was as follows. They said, actually, the DA and the ANC, badlala, they're playing with us, right? Or they're taking a mick, as they say in the UK. Why did they say that? They said all of this is a ploy to manufacture consent for 1%. Because if you come outright and say 2% value-added tax increase, what that will do is create market hostility, that will create public hostility. So instead of doing that, why not create some semblance of a fight, a difference of opinion, drama, and then come back to the public and then say, okay, we've agreed on a 1% compromise. I saw that opinion all over the place on social media. I'm not saying this is what's happening. I'm saying there's been skepticism from the beginning. But I think what's evident at this particular point is that the president was in on it. He was involved. And there's no way a finance minister would be able to push for any increase in a tax of this nature without the approval of his principal. Also, it's becoming very clear now that the ANC is actually more in favor of a VAT increase than was originally reported or originally their argument, because they try to make it seem as if, well, ANC ministers also disagreed, etc., etc. We are the ones who are saving you from the 2% increase that our ANC finance minister came and presented to you. That, I think, is becoming clear that it's not the case, because according to the reporting, this week, the ANC second deputy secretary general and the Minister of Monitoring and Evaluation, who sits in the presidency with Khumbudzo Ntshavheni. Remember the people who came and presented, and then that mic moment, the hot mic moment happened. It was the Minister of Finance and it was Minister in the presidency, Khumbudzo Ntshavheni. And now we are seeing another minister in the presidency, Maropini Ramokgopa, saying to the Democratic Alliance, and this is what apparently she said, the president's patience was wearing thin with the Democratic Alliance. We're getting tired of you, basically is what she was trying to say. And the ANC was reserving its options to possibly approach the economic freedom fighters. Approaching the EFF to get into the GNU if the Democratic Alliance doesn't agree. So I think the understanding from the presidency, the understanding from these ministers around this threat is the following. The Democratic Alliance has said consistently that their biggest opponent, their biggest fear, their biggest thing that they're trying to prevent is an MK and EFF alliance with the ANC, something that they termed as a doomsday coalition. Doomsday coalition. This is the thing that they don't want to see the most. So Having expressed that to the public as the reasons for joining the Government of National Unity, ANC-DA coalition, which is what it really is, the ANC has an appreciation that at any given moment, they can say to the Democratic Alliance, well, if you don't want this, we're going to go to KwaZulu-Natal, we're going to go to, EFF, and then we're going to get Malema, we're going to get Zuma, and then what are you guys going to do? Right? Obviously, Zuma is the leader of the Mkhonto weSizwe party, but he can't go to parliament per se. But still, that's basically what they're saying. So it seems as if here they said that DA is not sold on a VAT increase. They actually have said they want the finance minister, Enoch Godongwana, to reintroduce substantial cuts in spending and reorient spending towards job creation programs. The Democratic Alliance leader, John Steenhuisen, told the Sunday Times that his party remains opposed to any proposal to increase value-added tax. I respect the Democratic Alliance for this particular position because an increase in value-added tax in and of itself can be something that is particularly harmful. So the DA presented an alternative budget to the finance minister last week in which they actually want the following 4 things. Number 1, implementation of strict austerity measures instead of raising taxes. This would include cuts to government advertising, a reduction in spending on travel and catering across state departments, a freeze on all non-essential recruitment into the civil service. According to the Democratic Alliance, this would save 60 billion rands, the 60 billion rands that the minister Enoch Godongwana has said he wants to obtain through the VAT increase. We also know that there's a counter proposal from the SARS commissioner who has said, give me enough money to collect more taxes. And if you give me 3.5 billion, I will be able to get 800 billion rands for you in the next financial year. So DA is proposing austerity. The SARS commissioner, Edward Kisweta, is proposing better revenue collection. And the ANC is proposing at this particular point a VAT increase. Why is a VAT increase bad? We just need to go over that again so that you don't forget why a VAT increase in particular is something that is not desirable, right? Increasing value-added tax will have a wide range of negative economic, social, and fiscal impacts. That's the reality. What are the negative impacts of a VAT increase? Number 1, there's inflationary pressure. A higher VAT leads to an increase in the prices of goods and services, and this contributes to inflation. Even when you zero rate some products such as brown bread, etc., fuel costs, electricity costs, these costs are not insulated from VAT increases. Some products can be zero rated, right? No VAT is charged on them, but households will still experience an increase in the cost of living. Already households are over indebted. Already people are struggling to make ends meet. Already you hear people saying that there's more month at the end of my money. Not Musi my money, just my money. There's more month at the end of that. So if that's the case, increasing VAT, increasing the cost of a lot of the things that people put into that consumer basket on a month-to-month basis will have an inflationary pressure. And businesses, they don't, take the pain. They pass on any additional tax burden onto consumers. So if you think about the fact that electricity is already going up, the tariff increases have been announced, it's going up, it's already super expensive. This will have an impact on households, which will be adverse. It will reduce consumer spending. That's the second reason why VAT is not good for an economy. As goods and services become more expensive, consumers purchase less. Consumer purchasing power declines, and this leads to lower demand, which is what you don't want in an economy. You don't want lower demand because this impacts retail service sectors, particularly for non-essential goods. That basically means people will not be buying more. They'll be not going to supermarkets to buy as much. They won't be going to restaurants. They definitely won't be going into local tourism simply because they won't be able to afford things. And this leads to the third economic impact, economic slowdown. A decrease in consumer spending can lead to reduced business revenues, lower production, and potentially slower economic growth. as businesses experience lower demand, right? Because they're going to pass on the additional costs to the consumer. What they're then going to do, they're not going to necessarily keep the price of things the same. When the VAT goes up, your price goes up, right? So they're not going to reduce it so that it costs the same, even though there's now a 16 or 17% increase. As they do that, they will also start retrenching people, getting rid of people. They will stop hiring particular people who they need in order to operate those businesses because they need to make cost savings. The business will do everything it can to maintain its profit line at the same number. This is why VAT is an undesirable tax. Social impact of VAT is that it has a regressive effect on low-income households in particular. When someone is making 100,000 rands and someone is making 5,000 rands, increasing the cost of living, if their increased cost of living goes up by 500 rands because of all of the VAT increases you've put into the system in terms of how it affects their transport costs, their electricity costs, their internet costs, etc., that takes out 10% of a 5,000 rand salary, but it doesn't take out as much of a 100,000 rand salary. Do you see the difference? So it affects poor people worse than it does affect rich people. And already those are the people who are struggling. Already those are the people who we say ought to matter the most in the economy. So to have something that affects them in that way leads to further prospects of them being unemployed, and also leads to, a potential for an informal economy to grow. Because what higher VAT rates do is that they encourage tax evasion and expansion of the informal economy as consumers and businesses seek ways to avoid paying higher taxes. So if you want more tax collection, this can actually have a negative impact. So on the one side, you may argue that a higher VAT rate will increase tax revenue in the short term, helping governments to fund public services, infrastructure, social programs. This is what the government is arguing. But we have to be honest. For the ANC government, any increased revenue collected does not particularly go where it's supposed to go. And this is the issue. This is the issue. In China, if they say they're going to build a bridge in 6 months, they'll build a bridge in 4 months. In Germany, if they say they'll build a bridge in 3 months, they'll build a bridge in 1 month because of German efficiency. In Africa, if they say they'll build a bridge in 1 year, in 5 years, the president will be announcing there is progress on the Liabuya Bridge, which is coming soon. We have now blah, blah, blah. And then they'll say, and we are now increasing the allocation of budget to the Liabuya Bridge. Nothing ever comes to where it's supposed to go. Where the money ends up is in the hands of the slay queens with the yellow thighs. You know that. You'll see them buying houses saying, I'm moving from this house, I'm going to that house. Any Hoshkaramamba of this world, Nkari Uli China, they always end up with this money. This tenderpreneurship problem is well known. It's well known. There's widespread corruption. So whatever the Minister of Finance says over here is not what is experienced by the people on the ground here, right? So that's a real risk. There is a real risk of reduced revenue as well from other taxes. If consumer spending declines significantly, any VAT revenue gains are offset by lower levels of corporate income tax, lower levels of personal income tax because of reduced business activity and employment. Then you need to think about the situation about where South Africa is right now. South Africa right now is in a position where there is high unemployment. On the expanded definition, unemployment is at 42%. For youth in particular, unemployment between the ages of 15 to 35 is at 60%. Growth last year was low at 0.4%. 0.4% growth. So already you're beginning to see the impacts of the kind of approach that the ANC government has taken to this thing. So this is where I want to talk a little bit about fiscal strategy and austerity. Fiscal strategy is the government approach to government spending and taxation. It's the use of various policies to steer economic conditions, particularly at the macroeconomic level. So microeconomic level deals with individuals and firms, how they interact with each other. That's micro. Individuals, households, firms, how do they interact with each other? Macro is the higher level, looking at the holistic economy, right? How the nation interacts with the economy, not just the individual actors. Macro, micro, right? Microscope, macro, telescope. See the whole picture. So these policies are designed to influence aggregate demand, employment rates, inflation, and overall to stimulate economic growth. Fiscal strategies are implemented to promote stable and sustainable economic growth, to reduce poverty, and to address economic crisis. There are different stances and strategies that are applied by different people. Fiscal policy can be neutral, expansionary, or contractionary, depending on the decisions that are made by the policymakers. Expansionary policy is stimulus. That sometimes the government borrows more money, invests more in the public, invests more in hiring people. What we saw in America, for example, after the 2008 market crash was stimulus. What we saw in the United Kingdom after the same market crash was austerity. And we saw different charts. In America, the economy grew, and in the UK, it went like this. It was the opposite. And this is what happens, right? So what is the South African fiscal strategy? And this is where the ANC and the DA actually agree. They agree. They just disagree on how to achieve that strategy. And this is what you need to be aware of. Under President Ramaphosa, the fiscal strategy is a contractionary one. Minister Godongwana has focused a lot of his attention from his first speech on reducing the debt to GDP ratio. There's been a lot of focus on limiting the public wage bill. And you'll often hear a term known as fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation refers to a set of government policies aimed at reducing fiscal deficits and the accumulation of public debt. It involves measures such as reducing government expenditure or increasing tax revenue to improve the budget balance and promote sustainable public finances. Fiscal consolidation is often implemented to address challenges such as high debt levels or financial crises, and to, as the argument goes, to ensure long-term fiscal sustainability. So the key components of it are reductions in expenditure, revenue increases, raising tax, and trying to be efficient with how you use the money that is then left. But that's where the challenge often exists for the ANC. They will, cut spending, they'll raise the revenue, but they will not improve the efficiency. Anybody can tell you, whether it's in Gauteng or wherever the case may be, that they haven't seen improved delivery under the Godongwana or Ramaphosa era of fiscal strategy, right? From the Reserve Bank side, if you think about South Africa, there's been aggressive inflation targeting, and interest rates are relatively high to limit borrowing. These type of interventions are the interventions that are supported by the IMF. In fact, the IMF has been calling for South Africa to take bold steps to ease a suffocating debt burden and to boost economic growth. That's what they say. They say, reduce your debt, you're going to boost growth. What typically happens is you don't get boosted growth. You don't. It's happened in so many countries. What the IMF said is that what we are recommending is a fiscal adjustment of 1% gross domestic product per year for the next 3 years, right? And steps that could be taken to achieve this include wage discipline, accelerating reforms at struggling state-owned enterprises, privatization, tighter control of government procurement. So 3% of GDP over 3 years, and that will put public debt on a downward trajectory and lower public debt to more prudent levels of 60% to 70% of GDP in the next 5 years. This argument of focusing on debt really overlooks the fact that when you think about South African debt levels, even though 75% is high, and debt is not necessarily a good thing, it's not. Other countries in the G20 have higher debt to GDP ratios. South Africa still has a lot of wiggle room. What happens is that the IMF comes into many countries and implements these structural adjustment programs, and they have been detrimental to the growth of those countries. This is actually what ended up leading to the protest in Kenya, because the IMF went there and said, you guys need to raise taxes, etc., etc. And the youth of Kenya said, over our dead bodies, you're going to do that. And they protested, and the government had to backtrack. And the youth of Kenya were correct to call for, a reduction in taxes, not an increase. By the way, I spoke to a young Kenyan. It's that interview that I did is on my YouTube page, right? So now we've spoken about that, and you appreciate that the DA and the ANC actually agree. The meetings are continuing on Monday. Let's discuss this question of whether the EFF will join this Government of National Unity over this. First and foremost, Julius Malema wrote an article in Times Live, which is the publication that actually also publishes Sunday Times. And he made it very clear the EFF does not support an increase in value-added tax. The EFF will be protesting any increase in value-added tax. They'll go to the streets. They'll have mass protests. That's what he said. He wrote a detailed explanation saying, he was basically saying, to anybody trying to increase value-added tax. I had to mumble that just in case, right? So in saying that, in rejecting it vehemently, aggressively, vociferously, the EFF is not going to be an option for the ANC. I just think that this boogeyman is one that even the DA knows is not a real thing. Julius Malema has done some interviews indicating that he's not in a rush to jump into a coalition that will undermine the long-term interests of the economic freedom fighters. So I don't think it's a real thing to say that Julius Malema will join if there's such, if the DA doesn't want to. He would never take a decision. And those EFF guys now, they're pushing radical stuff. They would never join GNU to be ministers just so that they can increase VAT, because that will be the end of their political party. Imagine going into the GNU, DA says we don't want to increase VAT. You come in and you say, no, we're going to increase VAT. We are going into GNU now. The EFF won't do that, because if they're already on 9% and they do that, they would go to 3 or 2 in the next election. Then the long-term project of trying to actually get into the union buildings and run South Africa will be over. No politician would support that from the opposition benches at this particular moment. They wouldn't. They definitely wouldn't. I don't think that South Africa needs to go into more austerity at this particular point. There needs to be real investment in particular areas that will be job creating long term. Remember, when these guys are talking about job creation, they're not really trying to fix the problems that we've been talking about on this show. For instance, 93% of schools in the Eastern Cape, there are 5,046 schools in the Eastern Cape, ordinary schools, public schools. They don't have libraries. 93%. Only 10% have access to internet for learning. We're spending 350 billion on education per year. But that money is not creating the outcomes that are necessary. There was a reading panel report just published last week showing that 80% of the learners cannot read for meaning at the appropriate level, at the grade level that they're at. And they were looking at grade 4s. If you want to have more engineers, doctors, plumbers, electricians, etc., you need to invest in education. It's a long-term investment. It's one that will increase the labor participation rate. It's one that will increase the quality of production. It's one that will attract international investors and bring manufacturing back to South Africa in a big way. But they never invest on that. They sometimes focus on building schools. You often hear, no, so much has been allocated for building schools, building schools, building schools. Why do they love that? Because the tenderpreneurs with their hoshkarmaimas come there and they chow that money. And then you go look at a school that was supposed to cost 120 million rands, and it looks like it's a 20 million rand thing. Do you remember the Enoch Godongwana Stadium and how they built it? There was 23 million rand allocated to that thing. Those guys went and bought one stand, and then they gave the money to their people. And the thing did not look like a state-of-the-art facility, which is what it was described at in the reporting documents. Remember that? Politicians went there, etc., etc. It was another example. So I don't think austerity is needed. I think there's a lot of money in the system. The money is just going to tenderpreneurs. The whole tender system needs to be reevaluated. People who are related to politicians need to be blacklisted. You need to clean up that tender system, because there's a lot of money in the budget right now, which could go to the right places. If you look at the amount of waste in municipalities, there's a lot of money in the system. Unfortunately, when corruption prevails, the economy suffers. Nobody's gone to jail for state capture up till now. Nobody. It's supposed to be this big scandal. Nobody's in jail. So these are the realities. But EFF joining the GNU, I don't think that will happen. Anyway, guys, what do you think? I've been promising to talk about the book club. A video is coming about the book club. The book club is launching this week. I had said Sunday, but it's launching this week. Let me just connect my dots properly. We're coming with the book club. It's coming. Watch out for an announcement in the next video on the book club.